Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unpack one of the absolute most famous conflicts in all of ancient history, the Persian Wars. But hey, we're not just going to sit here and memorize dates and battle names today. No way. We're putting on our historian hats. We're going to analyze the actual causes and effects of these wars by looking at hard historical evidence. We're talking about how tiny short-term triggers created massive long-term ripple effects that literally reshaped the ancient world.
So, here's our game plan for today. First, we'll bust some myths about the Persian Wars. Then we'll examine the historical evidence. After that, we'll walk through a specific cause and effect example, use the claim, evidence, and reasoning toolkit, and finally, wrap it up with a transfer and final recap.
Let's jump right into Section 1, Myths of the Persian Wars, where we're rethinking this whole idea of heroes and villains.
If you've ever seen a movie, or maybe read a comic book about ancient Greece, you've almost certainly bumped into what we call the heroic myth. It usually paints this picture in very simple black and white terms, right? Like a tiny, totally united group of freedom-loving Greeks defending the world against the massive, evil, tyrannical Persian horde. But as historians, we kind of have to look way past the Hollywood script. The historical reality is just far more complex. The Greeks, they weren't a single peaceful nation at all. They were a collection of fiercely independent, often heavily fractured city-states that actually spent a lot of time fighting each other. And the Persians, well, they were anything but mindless villains. In fact, they were an incredibly organized, highly advanced, and honestly, a surprisingly tolerant administrative superpower.
Just take a look at the hard evidence we have of the Persian Empire at its absolute height. We're talking about an empire that stretched all the way from the Indus River to the Nile. To manage a territory that mind-bogglingly huge, leaders like Cyrus the Great and Darius I didn't just rely on fear. They relied on brilliant administration. They divided the empire into districts run by satraps, built this sprawling network of royal roads, a postal system, and even engineered vast underground water tunnels called qanats. But here's the real kicker. The Persians largely respected local traditions and religions. They successfully governed a multi-ethnic empire and allowed diverse peoples to maintain their own unique cultures. So definitely not a cartoon villain empire, this was the undisputed superpower of the ancient world.
Moving on to Section 2, Examining the Historical Evidence. Basically, how do we actually know what happened?
Before we dig into the actual sources, we absolutely need to clarify two crucial concepts for any working historian: source evidence and inference. Source evidence, that refers to the actual physical things we pull out of the ground or find in archives. This means primary texts, inscribed testimonies carved right into stone, or excavated weapons and pottery. It's the raw, physical data. Inference, on the other hand, is the logical conclusion a historian draws from that evidence. So think of it this way. If we find Persian arrows embedded in an Athenian wall, that's the evidence. The inference we make is that, well, a battle probably occurred there. We have to constantly distinguish between what we physically have in our hands and the conclusions we're drawing from it.
When it comes to the Persian Wars, our primary textual evidence relies really heavily on one guy, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. As highlighted in the 2500 Years exhibition, Herodotus actually wrote, "The purpose is to prevent the traces of human events from being erased by time. Among the matters covered is in particular the cause of the hostilities between Greeks and non-Greeks." You see, he explicitly wanted to record the cause and effect of this massive conflict for future generations.
Now, what's really fascinating here is this reminder about historical perspective. Herodotus is an invaluable source, for sure, but he was Greek. He wrote this from a Greek point of view. As modern historians, we can't just swallow his words as absolute, unbiased truth. We always have to evaluate his claims for bias when we use his texts to infer cause and effect. It's kind of like putting together a giant puzzle. We have to cross-reference his stories with physical excavations and totally different sources just to get the most accurate picture of the past.
All right, let's look at Section 3, Cause and Effect Example, where we'll be tracing the conflict.
This timeline perfectly illustrates a historical chain reaction. In 499 BCE, Greek city-states in Ionia rebelled, and Athens decided to send aid. Well, that interference directly caused Persian retaliation. In 490 BCE, the Persians invaded but got pushed back at the Battle of Marathon. Then, 10 years later, Xerxes returned with this massive force, leading to the famous battles at Thermopylae and Salamis, until Spartan-led forces finally crushed the remaining Persian army at Plataea in 479 BCE. Look at how every single event is a direct reaction to the one just before it. It's literally a domino effect. But history doesn't just stop when the fighting ends, right? We've got to look at the long-term effects. After the Persian Wars, Athens capitalized heavily on its massive naval success. In 477 BCE, they organized an alliance of Greek city-states called the Delian League, basically to keep protecting the region from Persia. However, over the next several decades, Athens essentially transformed this protective alliance into its very own empire, demanding tribute money from its so-called allies.
So, the crucial point here is that this massive victory actually planted the seeds for the next great disaster. Athens took that tribute money from its Delian League subjects and used it to enrich itself. They famously funded the reconstruction of huge temples on the Acropolis, including the Parthenon. And sure, while this was a beautiful symbol of Athenian pride and kicked off a golden age of art and democracy, it deeply angered the other Greek city-states. They felt like they were being extorted. Furthermore, Sparta, who always considered itself the greatest military power in Greece, grew incredibly jealous and fearful of Athens' exploding wealth and naval dominance. The stage was perfectly set for a massive internal explosion.
Let's move to Section 4, Claim, Evidence, and Reasoning. Time to open up the historian's toolkit. I want you to actively think about this question for a second. Based on the historical evidence we've just uncovered, did the Persian Wars permanently unify the Greek city-states? Keep that pop culture myth of the perfectly united, heroic Greeks in the back of your mind as you consider the actual evidence.
Okay, let's build a bulletproof historical argument together using our CER steps. Step 1, the claim. No, the Persian Wars absolutely did not permanently unify Greece. Step 2, the evidence. Historical records show that in 431 BCE, Sparta and its allies invaded Attica to attack Athens. And Step 3, the reasoning. Athens used the Persian Wars to build an incredibly wealthy empire. This arrogant display of power caused massive fear and jealousy among rivals like Sparta. Therefore, the ultimate long-term effect of defeating Persia was actually a devastating civil war among the Greeks themselves, which we now know as the Peloponnesian War. And that brings us to Section 5, Transfer and Final Recap. Why this matters today.
To quickly summarize the whole shebang, we completely threw out that heroic myth of a simple good versus evil conflict and replaced it with the complex reality of a fractured Greece and a highly advanced Persian superpower. We learned how to distinguish between hard source evidence and historical inference, while keeping a close eye out for biases in texts like those from Herodotus. We successfully mapped the short-term causes, tracing the spark of the Ionian Rebellion all the way through Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. And finally, we tracked the long-term effects, proving how the Greek victory ironically led to the oppressive Athenian Empire and eventually the disastrous Peloponnesian War.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why we study history this way. Evaluating cause and effect based on perspective and evidence isn't just about ancient Greece and Persia. It's a fundamental skill that transfers to understanding all of human history, and honestly, even modern geopolitics. When you learn to automatically ask, hey, what caused this? What is the long-term effect? And whose perspective is missing from the source? You become an incredibly sharp critical thinker.
So, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought. If Herodotus' perspective shaped how the entire world viewed the Persian Wars for over 2,000 years, how will future historians view our current events? What kind of biases will they find in the digital evidence we leave behind? Keep questioning your sources, keep looking for those hidden long-term effects, and never stop exploring. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.